What is functionalism? What are emotions and how do they form? Why should you go to an amusement park on your first date? Let's find out. In our last episode, we looked at the work of Wilhelm Wundt, the pioneer of experimental psychology. Wundt basically made psychology a scientific discipline, focusing on breaking down consciousness into its core elements, also known as structuralism. But not everyone agreed with this approach. While Wundt was focused on analyzing the structure of consciousness, another thinker, William James, was more interested in its function. Instead of asking what consciousness is made of, he said, well, what does consciousness do? William James was born in 1842 in New York City, into a wealthy and intellectual family. He initially studied medicine at Harvard, but he became more interested in psychology and philosophy. In the late 19th century, James actually began teaching the first psychology courses in the United States and published one of the most influential psychology books ever written, called The Principles of Psychology. This book laid the foundation for American psychology, introducing revolutionary ideas about consciousness, habit, emotion, and free will. James didn't really fancy the structuralist approach of Wundt that argued to break down consciousness into separate elements. Instead, he argued that mental processes should be studied in terms of their purpose and function. He basically said that consciousness is a stream, a continuous flow of thoughts, sensations, and emotions, instead of a collection of separate components. This idea became known as the stream of consciousness, a concept that later influenced both psychology and literature. James' functionalism was heavily influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Just as physical traits evolved to help organisms survive, James believed that mental processes evolved to help humans adapt. One of his most famous contributions was his theory of emotion, which he developed together with Carl Lange, a Danish physiologist. Before James, most people believed that emotions came before physical reactions. For example, if you see a bear in the forest, you might think, I feel afraid, so my body starts to tremble and run away. James, however, flipped this idea upside down. His argument was that bodily reactions come first and then the emotion follows as a result. So, according to the James-Lange Theory of Emotion, step 1 is you see a bear. Step 2 is your body reacts. Your heart races, you start to run. And 3, your brain interprets these physical changes as fear. Or, in James's words, we feel sorry because we cry. We feel angry because we strike. And we feel afraid because we tremble. This idea was groundbreaking because it suggested that emotions are not just mental experiences. They are deeply tied to the body's physical state. But not everyone agreed. In the 1920s, Walter Cannon and Philip Barth proposed a different explanation of how emotions work, now known as the Cannon-Barth Theory of Emotion. They argued that bodily reactions and emotions occur simultaneously, not in sequence. According to them, the body's physiological changes isn't enough to explain the full complexity of emotions. So let's return to the bear in the forest. According to Cannon and Barth, it works a little bit differently. First, you see the bear. Second, your brain, specifically the thalamus, processes the threat. 3, at the same time, it sends signals to your body and your brain. So it increases your heart rate, prepares you to run, and it produces the subjective experience of fear. And it all happens at the same time. So Cannon and Barth believed that the James-Lange theory had it backwards. Emotions don't depend on interpreting bodily changes. They arise in the brain at the same time the body reacts. And their argument had a strong biological foundation, because they pointed out that different emotions can produce similar physical reactions, like a racing heart in both fear and excitement, so bodily states aren't specific enough to determine emotion. And some emotional reactions happen too quickly for the body to fully respond first. So who was right? Well, as psychology progressed, both theories were found to be partially correct, but incomplete. Modern research in neuroscience and cognitive psychology has shown that emotions are complex and involve a combination of physiological arousal, so what's happening in the body, cognitive appraisal, how we interpret what's happening, and subjective experience, so what we feel internally. One of the most influential modern models is the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotion model, developed in the 1960s. This theory proposes that emotion equals arousal plus cognitive interpretation. So let's go back to the bear example once again. First, you see the bear. Second, your heart starts racing, so you feel aroused. Third, your brain labels the situation. That's a dangerous animal. And four, the result is the emotion of fear. In short, James was right to highlight the physical roots of emotion, and Ken and Bart were right to emphasize the brain's central role. And modern psychology sees emotion as the interaction between body, brain, and thought. Now, a little sidebar here. This theory also helps to explain fascinating psychological phenomena called the misattribution of arousal. Because our brains interpret emotions based on context, we can sometimes confuse the source of our feelings. So, for example, if you're on a roller coaster with someone and your heart is racing, you have sweaty palms and adrenaline pumping, your brain might interpret those physical signs not just as excitement, but as attraction to the person sitting next to you. This effect was famously demonstrated in the shaky bridge experiment by psychologists Donald Dutton and Arthur Aaron. Because men who met an attractive woman on a high, wobbly suspension bridge were more likely to call her afterwards than men who met her on solid ground. And the reason? Their bodies were already in a state of arousal, elevated heart rate, adrenaline, and their brains misattributed those feelings to the woman rather than the fear of the bridge. This shows just how easily emotion can be influenced by both our physical state and how we interpret it. A powerful reminder that feelings aren't always what they seem. It also makes you think about what a good first date might be. Maybe an amusement park or a haunted house. Is this bit ethical? I'm not sure. William James was also fascinated by the power of habit. He argued that much of human behavior is shaped by repeated actions, which gradually become automatic. In his book, The Principles of Psychology, he wrote, "The great thing, then, in all education is to make our nervous system our ally instead of our enemy." This idea foreshadowed behaviorist psychology, which would later emphasize how repetition and reinforcement shape behavior. More on that in a different video. James also explored the concept of free will. He believed that while habits strongly influence behavior, humans still have the power to make conscious choices, a perspective that remains a key debate in psychology today. His ideas on functionalism, emotion, habit, and free will continue to shape psychology today, influencing everything from neuroscience to education. Above all, James believed that psychology should be useful and applicable and grounded in human experience, a philosophy that remains at the heart of modern psychology. Thanks for watching.